Hello guys, I'm José Mayubi. I am host of the channel José Mayubi Path to Episteme. I am philosophy study from Brazil. Gui,
My name is Guilherme. I'm a philosophy ex-graduate. I used to study philosophy. Now I'm graduating at economics, and we will be hosting Professor Kees Waal, and Jose will continue with the introductions.
okay, it's an honor having you here, Professor Case. First, guys, a brief introduction, Professor Case, a little about Susan Haack. First, I would like to thank Professor Susan Haack for introducing me to Professor Case. It's a tremendous honor to speak today with editor-in-chief and president of the Charles Percy Society. He's also a professor of philosophy at the University of Indianapolis. Today, we'll discuss the current relevance of the feminist science within reason be Haack, as as well as some of Professor Key's works for extents on pragmatism, which fertily has a big translation into Brazilian Portuguese. So, guys, agora now I speak in my mother language because showing you Susan Hack translate em português e do Case. Bom, pessoal, infelizmente não dá para ver aqui no Kindle, né? Mas tem a tradução para o português Defendendo a Ciência da Susan Hack, que ela foi traduzida pelo Eli Vieira e é da editora Stanford Books. Já o livro do Case, pessoal, tem a tradução pela editora Loyola, salvo engano, é o Cassiano Terra Rodrigues. Correct, Professor Case? This translation in Portuguese. É Professor Cassiano Terra Rodrigues. Translation your own pragmatism book.
That's correct. Yes.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Hmm.
So, Gui, let's start the first.
So, uh, the first question is just a second. Well, Professor Case, could you share with us which text or intellectual encounter first sparks your deep engagement with the pragmatist tradition? And furthermore, how do you reflect on your role as editor-in-chief of the Transactions of Charles Sanders Peirce Society? And what significance does it hold for you personally and philosophically?
Okay. Yeah. Now, first of all, thank you so much for having me. It's really nice to talk to people in Brazil, and I guess you're in São Paulo. I saw that somewhere in the email, which I have been many years ago to one of the conferences held by Ivo Ibri, um, which was really nice, and I met many nice people in Brazil. So I am. So you said that you are a recent graduate of philosophy who then moved into economics. I started out as an economist and then moved into philosophy, so I went the exact opposite direction. And when I was studying economics, the sort of it was in the heyday still of neoclassical economics, was really much the application of mathematics to macroeconomic phenomena. And there was this running joke. This running joke was about what makes something good science. And there were two answers to that. It's either, is this good science because it gives you an accurate description of the world, or it is good science because it enables us to predict things about the world, even though it doesn't describe the world. And as we all know, economics fails miserably on both counts. So, in part, my disenchantment with economics caused me to move first to sociology and then to philosophy, where I got specifically interested in philosophical anthropology. People like Helmut Plessner, Max Scheler, Arnold Galen, and Martin Heidegger, so mostly Germans. And for some reason or another, and I'm not entirely sure how this happened, this is quite a long time ago, I got interested in George Herbert Mead, and specifically in the question that I was sort of struggling with at the time, what makes a free market system work? And I thought I found in Mead some interesting answers to that question. So I wrote my master's thesis on George Herbert Mead in relationship to how does a free market system works. And it is my studies in Mead that in the end got me interested in Peirce, but again, sort of through a weird way. I took a summer course on Locke and Berkeley at Oxford University, and I found in Berkeley some things that really, really resemble core pragmatic sort of themes that I found in Mead. And it is trying to figure that out and trying to sort of get a better idea about that relationship that I stumbled upon Peirce, because Mead actually does not talk a whole lot about Peirce. So that's how I got interest in Peirce, and from Peirce I got, of course, interest in pragmatism, and that got me then into the United States because Peirce is an American philosopher. So I'm also, as you say, the editor of the Transactions. I have to make one correction to your introduction. I am not a professor at the University of Indianapolis, although people do tend to make that mistake these days. I am a professor at Indiana University at Indianapolis,
Oh,
which is a big difference because University of Indianapolis is really small, and IU Indianapolis is really, really big. So one of the things that got me into at the University of Indiana, at Indiana University in Indianapolis, which was then still combined with Purdue University, was that the Peirce Edition project is located there. And Nathan Hauser asked me to join the Peirce Edition project, and that then got me into the Transactions, which is now published by Indiana University Press. So the Transactions are a journal that is officially published or is owned by the Peirce Society. It's about half of the journal is about Peirce, and about half the journal is about American philosophy more generally. I like doing it because it keeps me young and energetic. I get to read a lot of really interesting stuff, and it keeps me connected with interesting people as well. And as a matter of fact, I have a background in editing as well, not just from the Peirce Edition project, but also when I graduated as an economist, I became an economics editor for a Dutch glossy engineering magazine, and was working a lot with journalists and editing stuff. So that's what I do for the Transactions. I'm currently editing a paper by John Gray, who is a really interesting guy. He's Australian. He developed in the 1980s a software program to improve the manufacture of galvanized steel for BHP, a really large Australian company. And that software program is really heavily inspired by Peirce's logic and his semiotics and his pragmatism. So, and he sort of refers to it as an early precursor to artificial intelligence. This has nothing whatsoever to do with philosophy. It has a lot to do with Peirce. So the Transactions is not just a philosophical journal either. We publish, especially with respect to Peirce, also non-philosophical things. So that's about my background a little bit, and that's a little bit about the Transactions. Does that answer your questions?
Professor Kees, I have a curious. What's your favorite books in economics?
My favorite books in economics.
Yes.
Now, I left economics really a long time ago, so I don't really read a lot about it. I did. I like Schumpeter a lot. I'm actually what got me into philosophy is in part spending quite a lot of time in the history of economic thought, and so that's what I sort of got attracted to. And for the rest, when I was studying economics, mostly economics is one of the disciplines where you don't really read books, you read papers, journal papers, and so on.
Okay, Professor Kees, what was your first contact with Susan Haack's work, and how do you assess the importance of her project of defending science within reason today, especially in context of vague and polarized debate between scientism and cynicism?
Okay, yeah, good questions. So my dissertation was my first dissertation proposal was in economics, but I didn't get along with my supervisor, so I dropped that project and got back into philosophy again. And I got into contact with a professor at the University of Twente, Dude Nauta, who was one of the sort of more renowned Peirce scholars in the Netherlands at the time, because I'm originally Dutch and I was studying in the Netherlands. And we got to talking about my ideas about what to write a dissertation about and about Peirce more generally, and what to do about a dissertation. And he suggested that I contacted Susan Haack. And this was because he had gone to a conference a couple of years before, and they had a dinner afterwards, and he was sitting right next to her during the dinner, and he really liked her, and he really liked what she had to say and her approach to Peirce. So I got to read some of her work, and this is of course this is in the early 1990s, so even Evidence and Inquiry had not yet been published. So I read some of her papers, and I really liked her writing style. I really liked her approach to things, and that caused me to contact her directly and to come to Indiana, to come to Miami and talk to her there as well. And I ended up studying with her and doing my PhD my PhD at the University of Miami and writing my dissertation under her supervision. So that's how I got to know her, um, and uh, and I still do know her today. Of course, her book Defending Science Within Reason only came out after I left the University of Miami. I left in, I think, 1997 or 1998, and she published that in 2003. It's a book on the philosophy of science. It's a very interesting book on the philosophy of science because it's very different. It takes a very different direction than sort of the typical work in the philosophy of science. And this is the same approach she took in Evidence and Inquiry, where she takes a very different take on epistemology as well. She sees science very much, at least in my interpretation, as a human enterprise, something that is deeply fallible, and with a very clear conception that there is such a thing which is often ignored as bad science, and tries to make a distinction between not between science and what is not science, the traditional sort of demarcation problem, but what's the distinction between good science and bad science? And a lot of that then relates to her conception of scientific inquiry, which she takes to an important part from Peirce. And her distinction between old differentialism and new cynicism clearly plays into that. I think it has great contemporary relevance, and I will give you an example which I have been working on myself recently. So you probably know something about the current American situation with respect to science and politics. The Trump administration is not very gung-ho on science. It is actually quite hostile and has led to lots of grants being terminated and stuff like that. The Trump administration also has a penchant for governing through executive orders. And on May 23rd, Donald Trump issued an executive order which is titled Restoring Gold Standard Science. And I have been looking at that executive order and sort of trying to figure out what is meant by restoring gold standard science. Of course, this is Trump. Everything has to be gold. And I found that Haack's distinction between old deferentialism and new cynicism proved to be really helpful in trying to figure out what is going on in this order and what would be the best strategies for scientists and people that are in support of science to respond to this approach. And if you read this executive order, it is very much written in the style of what Haack calls old deferentialism. And it comes with 9 differentialist style criteria and then leaves it up to political appointees to determine whether a study meets those criteria. And if it doesn't, then it is not a scientific study. And the executive order even contains language on how to penalize people who claimed that it was scientific. So you can lose your grant, you can lose your job if you work for the federal government, and so on. Now, a study may be deemed unscientific because it is not structured according to the falsifiability of hypotheses, so it has a very strong Popperian sort of background there, because it's not reproducible, not transparent, is not sufficiently open to alternative viewpoints. So people doing research in medicine are not looking at alternative medicine and so on. So those are the kind of things that they deem to be important. Now, it's quite clear that there are very few, if any, scientific studies that meet all these 9 criteria. And as a consequence of that, the Trump administration is capable of able to use this executive order to dismiss any science it doesn't like on political grounds. So this executive order, very interestingly, uses new cynicism as a way to weaponize the old differentialism. So it can be used to reject any study that is generally considered scientific. So the scientific world considers it scientific, but it is disagreed with, or the results are being disagreed with by the Trump administration. So that's how you can use Haack's notion of new cynicism and old differentialism to sort of look at this executive order and see exactly so how can we look at that? And that caused me to identify the ideology that steers this executive order as a combination of the two, which I ended up calling new differentialism. I had almost submitted the paper, and then when I was ready to submit it, it suddenly dawned on me that I can combine old differentialism and new cynicism to new differentialism. And new differentialism would then be a way of approach to science that has learned from the new cynics on how to, in an almost Machiavellian way, to cynically apply differentialism, not as a way to establish that something is scientific, but as a way to sort of exclude scientific studies by calling them non-scientific because they don't meet these really high criteria. So let me give you one example of how that works, because it's sort of interesting. So the first 2 criteria are reproducibility and transparency. And one of the studies that lies behind this whole executive order, which sort of inspired it, is a study conducted by Harvard quite a long time ago. So I think it's in the 90s or the early 2000s, which is called the 6 Cities Study. And here researchers looked at about 8,000 participants between 15 and 16, or for about 15 to 16 years. And they found an association between death rates and particulate matter in the air. So it's a combination. It combines medical data with environmental data. Now, the transparency criteria requires very explicitly that all data that are being used in the study are made publicly available. This is in part important because the second criteria, reproducibility, requires that people can reproduce the results by redoing the results using the same data. Now, it's quite clear that this kind of private participant in the study. And that made it illegal for them to disclose that information. So this study can be dismissed as a scientific study because it fails the transparency criterion of public policy. It's quite clear that this is not just this study that's involved, but any study that connects the health effects of environmental factors, because it always will involve private data of people that cannot be shared and cannot also be anonymized because that is too difficult, or in the six cities study, it's even impossible. So here you can see how using really strict criteria of what counts as science and what doesn't count as science as a means to exclude things as being scientific, and then use also the old deferentialist view that if it isn't scientific, it isn't worth anything. Consequently, it cannot be used for any reason. So I think that her sort of way of looking at science through these two lenses, the two extremes, new differential or old differentialism and new cynicism, is really helpful here. So I think it's really good.
It seems a very arbitrary way that the government is using the definition of science to, you know, uh, uh, using a term that's very in vogue today. It's very easy for the government to cancel studies he doesn't deem scientific via a very arbitrary criteria of defining science in this sense, right?
Yes, but the criteria are not they're not really arbitrary in a way. That is, if you read it without paying too much attention to it, if you sort of cursory read it, it sounds really plausible in the sense that it really uses the language of all differentialism, of what makes a study a good study, and talks about things as reproducibility, which people think is pretty typically a good thing. Transparency, with
Yes.
people is typically is a good thing. Falsificationism, which people typically think is a good thing, and so on. And looking at different perspectives, which people think is typically a good thing, but then put it in a way that makes it very hard for a study to meet all those criteria, which is the requirement, and gives political appointees a really large sort of leeway, or a lot of leeway, to distinguish between what counts as transparency and what doesn't count as transparency, so they can use it to disqualify research.
So it's the
It uses the
process
language
that
of science, and it uses the kind of things that scientists find important, and weaponizes it against science itself.
so the language is not arbitrary, but the process might be.
The process, yes and no. In a way, the process is arbitrary, but the process is also political. And then it sort of gets into the question, how arbitrary is politics? Politics is typically inspired by very different things than scientific integrity and stuff like that. So those kind of things come to steer what counts as scientific then. And so it is, I don't think it's quite arbitrary, but it is definitely so Susan also makes this distinction between genuine reasoning and fake reasoning, and sham reasoning, and you get into very much and very quickly into this area of sham reasoning, where you are trying to defend what are essentially scientific outcomes by referring to things that have nothing to do with science at all.
Understood. Now on to the next question. How would you define pragmatism today, and in what ways did the Scottish common sense philosophy shape its early development?
Now, there in a way two different ways to look at pragmatism. If you look at what the people who have affiliate themselves with pragmatism and so on, what they find important. You can look at pragmatism as a way of doing philosophy that is inspired by or is in broad agreement with Peirce's pragmatic maxim. So that would sort of put it in a fairly sort of narrow way, although it's not as narrow as it initially sounds. Or you can look at it as a way of doing philosophy that is inspired by a group of people that are canonically associated with pragmatism. So some pragmatists are not really spending all that much time with the pragmatic maxim, but spend time on other things that Peirce is doing, other things that James is doing that are sort of in broad alignment with pragmatism. Um, so those are two ways in which you can look at pragmatism. Um, what you saw historically is that common sensism, especially Scottish common sensism, has become very popular in the United States in the beginning of the 19th century. And I think that is in part due, a consequence of the fact that Scottish common sensism is a way of doing empiricist philosophy that still allows a place for God and religion. Because if you look at Hume, um, empirical philosophy, or actually philosophy more generally, sort of ends in skepticism. And when you want to talk about God and when you want to talk about religion, you end up writing books that Hume explicitly said should be burned because they do not contain information about matters of fact, nor they do contain mathematics. So they found people in the United States, especially, and probably in Britain too, but they found in common sensism a way in which they could maintain a rational and reasonable and philosophical debate about God and religion. The Scottish common sensists inspired the people who inspired people like James and Peirce, because since Scottish common sensism was quite popular, it was quite popular at Harvard at the time. People like Francis Bowen, who taught both Peirce and James philosophy, would use it frequently in his courses as well, and therefore it got to inspire pragmatism or the pragmatists. It probably features into the anti-metaphysical stance of the Metaphysical Club as well, because one of the things that critical common that Scottish common sensism does is it rejects negatively towards the sort of the metaphysical presuppositions of the rationalists and the empiricists because they don't go anywhere. Um, so you get pragmatism that, in a way, even though Peirce doesn't really talk about common sensism early on, and I'm not entirely sure how James talks about it early on, uh, you can see that pragmatism is a approach to philosophy that is grounded in our practical lives and our common sense beliefs about the world, and then we move out from there and try to figure out how to talk about things that are not of an immediate practical relevance or that are not sort of immediately commonsensically accepted. So in that sense, pragmatism is an outgrowth in a way of common sensism. Um, but yeah, especially in Peirce's case, there is a big impact of Kant as well. Kant's critical philosophy plays majorly in Peirce's view. He famously read Kant when he was still a teenager, especially the Critique of Pure Reason. And so you get in Peirce, in a way, a combination between this empiricist, critical common senses sort of background and this focus on the practical, which you also find in Kant, and then the critical approach, which you also find in Kant. So you get a more critical common sensism, which is in part inspired probably by his reading of Hamilton.
Um, could you perhaps comment on a passage from your book on pragmatism, fortunately available in Portuguese, that you believe that best encapsulates the spirit of pragmatism?
That's a good question, and I'm very sorry. I don't know the answer to that. Um, the book on pragmatism I wrote a long time ago It's an introductory book that goes through the main pragmatists, but doesn't really, how do you say that? It doesn't really, it had a very strict word count, and I couldn't get a conclusion squeezed into it. So it doesn't come with some grand conclusion about this is pragmatism. It just ends, actually, it just ends with Susan. Um, so I cannot really direct you to any place in that book which most tightly talks about, or most clearly talks about pragmatism, apart perhaps from the area in which, so the passage in which I talk about Peirce and Peirce's use of pragmatism. There are two places where I talk about Peirce in relationship to pragmatism very clearly, which is when I talk about his paper, How to Make Our Ideas Clear. And then again, when I talk about the pragmatism lectures of 1903 and how Peirce is responding to William James in part in his correspondence with James and also in the lectures themselves. And then it follows with a later a discussion of Peirce's later pragmatism, which I think is probably the best place to look for if you want to have a very clear concept of what pragmatism is. When Peirce is sort of forced to go back to his early work where he didn't even use the word pragmatism, and also has to come to terms with the ways in which he misunderstood and misrepresented his own views as being too nominalistic. And it takes him a while to sort of basically come to agree with the position that he initially lays out in How to Make Our Ideas Clear. Does that help?
Great answer, Professor Case. I like so much our book, especially in Brazil. Um, Brazil, it's very difficult, good work about pragmatism. Brazil, um, study philosophy in Brazil, focus particularly in modern philosophy and classical philosophy. Contemporary, it's very difficult. It's very difficult. It's
Okay.
an honor having you here again. So, Professor Case. How would you assess the significance of the pragmatist philosophical tradition in shape Susan Haack's conception of science? And in what ways made a careful reading of your book on pragmatism offer a complementary perspective to Haack's defense of science within the bounds of reason?
Yeah, good question. Yeah. I think a key aspect is Haack's focus on inquiry. The air quality is really bad in Indianapolis at the moment, and I have some asthma issues, and I apologize for coughing every now and then. So her key focus is on inquiry. When you look at science, the thing to look at is inquiry, because then you can sort of at, attack the question, what makes inquiry good, what makes science good, and how can we make a distinction between good science and bad science? So Peirce talks about inquiry in terms of doubt and belief. That is, you start to inquire into something when you doubt something, and you stop inquiring the moment you gain a stable belief. Mead and Dewey are sort of a little bit later, and they talk about inquiry more in biological terms, like resolving an indeterminate situation and then reaching a homeostatic equilibrium, which is all very much sort of biological and post-Darwin. And I think that science must be taken to be part of this. So it's very clearly that science is a human enterprise. It is deeply fallible. It is done by some people who are really good at what they're doing, who are really conscientious about what they're doing. It's done by some people who are not really good, but really conscientious. And there are people who are doing it for very different reasons than finding out what the true answers are to the questions they're asking. But they want to have a Nobel Prize, they want to make a career, they want to get grants, they want to have graduate students working for them and stuff like that. So in that sense, you get a conception of science that is very focused on the activity of doing science, which is fallible. So it brings in Peirce's fallibilism. It relates to common sense, critical common sense. It's grounded in practice. Common sense, of course, has a long track record of being successful because that's why it is commonsensical. Um, and it's also something that is not something that you develop as an individual. It is not a personal accomplishment, but it's something that you inherit from your culture. And many things that are common sense go back not just generations, but thousands of years. It's very much grounded in practical knowledge. So this means that a defense of science should relate to our practical knowledge and try to be grounded in practical knowledge. And a evaluation of science should be grounded in common sense, but not just what people happen to believe or happen to think is right, but in a critical common sense. But uh, even a critical common sense is still common sense.
Great answer, Professor Case. I have a question. I like so much the the book's hack a part about all the differentialism, inductivism. So my question, Professor Case, what are the characteristics of the old differentialists, both inductivists and deductivists, as described by Hack? By Hack, sorry.
Yeah. So you're asking about the relationship between all differentialism and the sort of the inductivist and deductivist approaches made by the old differentialists, which you find in people like Carnap and Popper and so on. Yeah, I think you can say that um, the old differentialism is a way of looking at science that focuses quite clearly on methods. What determines whether something qualifies as science or what determines whether something qualifies as a scientific result or scientific evidence is determined by what method is used to obtain those results or what methods are used in inquiry. People like the inductivists and the deductivists are, I think, particularly concerned with the demand of objectivity, and more specifically by removing anything that can taint it with subjectivity. Um, and and that brings them to logic, because logic is considered to be objective. It is transparent in the sense that if you look at the deductive argument, anybody will see that the conclusion will follow. At least that's the idea. So ideally, everybody who knows logic could adjudicate whether the conclusion of any scientific research, um, whether those conclusions are indeed drawn from the evidence that is being presented or whether that is not the case. So in a way, you see a shift away from sensory impressions, which is still very prominent in sort of the old empiricists, because sensory impressions are in the end subjective and not communicable, to structure, which is objective and communicable. And consequently, to make something scientific, it is something that has to be sort of captured in that kind of structure. And it is the structure that then determines whether you should believe what someone says, not the fact that they had certain experiences. So the methods, but the important thing to realize about all this is that they focus on logic, they get their inspiration from logic. So the methods that they advocate are themselves not products of science, but they are in a way externally imposed upon science. And ideally, and comes from logical positivism specifically, the methods, and this is very clear in deduction, should be tautological. That is, they should not be empirical. They should not add any empirical sort of positive knowledge. They're not facts about the world. Consequently, they cannot possibly be false either. So that is a great thing about it. So in that sense, the old differentialist tries to defend a position where the products of science and science itself is being defined in terms of something that is objective and is something you cannot really doubt, that is transferable, and so on. It doesn't quite work because, as you probably know, anything that is tautological doesn't really say much about the world. You don't learn much about cats to know that they're all cats, or you don't learn much about bachelors to learn that they are by definition unmarried, and so on. So, in that sense, uh, the old deferentialist, if you take it sort of really cynical, is someone who has never played pool, who knows classical mechanics really well. So he's going to tell you how to play pool, and if you don't follow the rules of classical mechanics, then even if you score a point, it doesn't really count because you didn't use the right method. So that's sort of the the old differentialist.
So, on that note, what are the principal distinctions between classical cynicism and its contemporary expressions? To what extent do contemporary cynics exhibit a genuinely skeptical stance towards science, or is such a perception perhaps a misreading of their position?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. So the old cynicism, as you probably know, is really a virtue ethics, right? The idea of the old cynics is to live in agreement with nature, and that's the only true good. You should not be um, perverted by the artificiality of society, by social conventions. In fact, the old cynicism is a rejection of society, but a rejection that is sort of accompanied by something else, namely um, a a very strong sense of personal autonomy, a very strong sense of being able to lead your own life individually apart from society. So the cynics would reject social status, they would reject worldly possessions, they would steer away from politics. There's this famous story of Diogenes the Cynic who is caught drinking water from a cup, which he says is his only possession. And then someone shows him how you can drink water with your hands and you don't really need a cup. So he throws his cup away. You don't even need a cup. Um, so it comes with a commitment. And it comes with certain beliefs, and it comes with a very strong sense of, of truth and righteousness and so on. New cynics are very different. They tend to embrace society, as Peirce points out, and as Haack also points out, they tend to be literary critics. They're people who like to read books and stuff like that, and see society from sort of a more cultural and way and so on. They tend to be politically active. They tend to have a strong focus on equality and pluralism, which then causes them to reject science because science is being perceived as elitist. It demands conformity. Well, if you claim that something is true, then if I say that something is true, that means that you should agree with me because it is true, right? So, in that sense, the new cynics, they are not virtue ethicists. They're not embracing a virtue ethics. They don't believe that one should turn one's back to society. They have um, different ideas about what constitutes a good society. They are politically active, and they have ideas about equality and pluralism that they stand for. So the old cynicism is basically a moral idealism. It comes with values like autonomy. It comes with values like honesty. So it has a commitment to truth. It has a commitment to personal integrity. So that technically, if you look at it that way, the old cynic could support science if only it were possible to remove it from the corrupting influence of society. The new cynic doesn't believe it is possible to remove science from the corrupting influence of society. It is sort of, yeah, impossible to do science without it being corrupted, and therefore um, you should always look at science and its result as with great suspicion and with great pessimism. That results are most likely not the consequence of the integrity of the inquirer, but are more likely the results of the kind of things that people normally do. It's a job they want to get done, and they want to get out of it as much as they can personally. So the new cynics do not believe that science can ever be free from corruption. People are selfish, dishonest, always driven by hidden motives. And that makes science, as it is traditionally conceived, as a disinterested enterprise for the striving of truth, beauty, and goodness, completely impossible. So in that sense, the new cynics are quite different from the old cynics, I think. They have a different view of humanity, a different view of man.
Great answer. I agree your answer, Professor Case. Professor Case, given Susan Haack well-known critique of the vague and sometimes rhetoric inflat use of the term scientific evidence, could you clarify what precisely constitute scientific evidence in her framework? Do you want to repeat the question? No, no.
No, I got the question. Yeah. So yeah, as you probably know, Haack is very critical of the honorific use of science. So to call evidence scientific, or this sort of the idea that to call scientific evidence, no, sorry, this is sort of to say that to call evidence scientific is all you need to say to justify what you're saying. It means it can be trusted. It means that it is true and stuff like that. So the honorific use of science is something that already sort of in a way justifies the truth of what you're saying when you say it is scientific evidence. But when you start looking under the hood, then things become different. As not all scientific research is equal, and that is sort of the point that she is making quite frequently, the idea that there is bad science as well as good science. Because the differentialist seems to have a preoccupation with the problem of demarcation, and because of that, it fails to draw this other distinction, that is the distinction between well-conducted research and poorly done research. The differentialist tends to claim that the moment you use the scientific method, what you are doing is science and the results are scientific. But again, methods can be used poorly. So Haack's response is that we really need to look at evidence as a product of inquiry and then ask ourselves, how well has it been conducted? And worry much less about the question whether it is scientific or not. Because to call something scientific is just to put a label on it, and often it seems it can be a quite deceptive label. There are many people who use the word science and scientific when it is not appropriate to use it. Does that answer your question?
Well, it's very interesting the way you articulated your answer because it seems like that her account accommodates a dynamic view of science,
Mhm.
including like theory change, empirical revision, and still maintains epistemic rigor.
Right. Yes. Because what gives rigor to science is not the method, but what gives rigor to science is this the attitude with which the inquiry is being engaged in. And if you engage in inquiry with the attitude, with the desire to sort of get your questions answered, then the methods will follow from that. And since we and when we move through different kinds of problems, um, science is dynamic because the methods change on the way as a product of science. So in a way, the old differentialist approach to science is really static because it overlays on science a specific methodology that it believes is the only way in which something can be considered science. And it's not even a scientific methodology, but it comes from logic and mostly from a logic that is sort of a priori. So if both the methods of doing research and the outcomes of research are products of science, then the discoveries you make are going to change how you're going to move forward, and that will involve different methods. So that leads to scientific revolutions because you're going to use a different conceptual framework, or you're going to use different technologies to look at things, and that can really change things, right? You can, for instance, look at the way in which hardcore genetics is being used in history to solve certain problems that were previously used, tried to be solved by reading old manuscripts and stuff like that. So in that sense, yeah, it's very dynamic and very open to revision, and none of this is at the expense of rigor. So one of the sort of things that sort of is the way in which people criticize sometimes Kuhn's structure of scientific revolutions, in that you get these really radical changes that are essentially irrational because they are sort of a completely different way of looking at the world, and you lose your continuity. I don't think you have that problem with her approach.
Professor Kees, I have a question. Can you explain how Haack used the crossroad analogy as a tool to help her development the very complex theory of evidence, literally spelled out in evidence and inquiry? Inquiry, sorry.
Yes. Um, so she is responding. So she refers to her view as found herentism, right? She is trying to find a way that is a response to two ways of looking at the justification of knowledge that she believes are not really working, foundationalism and coherentism. And both have really established sort of problems and criticisms. Um, she uses the crossword analogy to sort of make this clear by bringing in the element of coherence, which is the relationship between the how do you call it? Those kind of things, that the the entries you put in the crossword puzzle, where they intersect and so on, and what you can learn from the empty places from based on what is already filled out and what intersects it. But it also at the same time refers to the cues that are being used to fill out the crossword puzzle, right? You need to have certain cues that lead to certain entries, and then you can use those entries to to sort of get an idea about what the other entries will be when you are not entirely sure about how to interpret the cues of those entries. So in that sense, you get an interesting way, an interesting interplay between um, the relationships between different aspects of knowledge. So this brings in the coherence aspect and the relationship of that whole structure with something that is outside of that structure, which are the cues that feature into the crossword puzzle. So in that sense, the crossword analogy is a really neat tool to sort of indeed sort of bring out this way in which our knowledge sort of hangs together um, in a really helpful way. So Peirce, and I don't know the degree to which it's inspired by Peirce, but Peirce uses this interesting sort of analogy, which is a little bit similar. Um, Peirce makes a distinction between two types of reasoning, which he calls chain reasoning and um, cable reasoning or rope reasoning. It's typically referred to as rope reasoning, although Peirce talks about cable. So chain reasoning is what he ascribes to Descartes, where you have this foundation, and that foundation relates to your beliefs through a chain of arguments in which every link is is, is sort of there is just one link connecting each link with one another, which means that if one link breaks, the entire cable breaks. And then he compares that with what he thinks is more indicative of the Middle Ages, which is reasoning along the lines of a cable where you have many fibers that are twisted together. And even if one fiber snaps, that still leaves the cable intact. And you can weave in different kind of strands to repair the cable and so on. So in that sense, he is you get something that is more solid, something that is more flexible, something that is better able to withstand um, the various forces of criticism and so on than the traditional foundational way. And you get something that is not sort of floating in the air as typical coherence theories tend to be.
Well, Professor Case, in a 2010 paper, Susan Haack identifies 6 signs of scientism. Could you briefly explain what they are and why she considers them problematic?
Yes, so yeah, that's a very interesting paper. Um, of course, the Trump administration outdid her by giving 9 signs of science, but hers are a little bit better. So, as I already noticed, there is this way in which people tend to use the word science in a honorific sense. That is, the moment you identify something as science, it is considered to be good. And I think you can really see that in people who are scientifically minded. That is, they really want that honorific title of science being put on something. The second sort of point that he makes is that scientifically minded people have a tendency to adopt a scientific terminology and methods, even in places where they don't do any real work. So there is this sort of sense that the moment at which it looks scientific, you're already sort of going in the right direction. And I learned that in part when I was studying economics, where it was not uncommon for you to read a paper about something, and then sort of halfway the paper, the author delves deeply into calculus and starts to do all kind of fancy stuff. And in the end, you come to realize that he could have skipped it. He could just go straight to the conclusions because the whole scientific, mathematical, complicated apparatus doesn't really do anything substantial. So there is this sort of infatuation with certain kinds of methods that are then being considered to be something that makes a study scientific. So that leads then in the third one to the third thing he makes a preoccupation with the scientific method and the idea that deep down there is only one scientific method. I think it's fair to say that the scientific method by itself is not sufficient to make something a scientific study. Many people can use the scientific method in ways that are totally inappropriate for science. It's also very clear that there is not one scientific method. There are many, many ways in which people do science that are considered to be scientific, and that different disciplines call for different kinds of methods. Of course, the scientific method is a handy way to use if you are really concerned about trying to distinguish science from things that are not science and things that are not science but look like science. So the problem of demarcation becomes a major sort of thing that scientists are really interested in, because they want to make sure that things do not pass for science that don't really qualify as science because they don't use this scientific method. So that brings me to 4, I believe. A consequence of all this and is that scientists, I have trouble pronouncing that word, I'm sorry. Scientists have a tendency to denigrate everything else. So if it is not scientific, it's not really worth much. The logical positivists have gotten into this habit of rejecting everything that does not qualify as science as being cognitively meaningless because it doesn't pass the verification principle. And Wittgenstein specifically has been quite keen on calling everything that is not scientific or not philosophical nonsense. Of course, Wittgenstein also, and this is where he differs from the logical positivists especially, Nietzsche also said that the most important things in life are nonsense, right? It is the ethics is really something that he was found important, and that's not something you can reason about in any philosophical or scientific way. But the general sort of tendency among the scientists is that if it's not science, it's not worth anything, and you saw that very clearly also in the Trump executive order. If it's not scientific, it cannot be used for anything. The 6th point is that um, scientists tend to be painfully optimistic about what science can do. If you look at people talking about brain science or biochemistry or genetics, they believe that they can solve all problems. So if you fall in love with somebody, it can be completely and exclusively explained in terms of the release of chemicals in your body and how those chemicals sort of change you in the kind of way that lay people refer to as being in love. When you are committing crimes, there might be something that's in your genes that is responsible, so you can give a scientific genetic explanation of not following the law and stuff like that. So, and it's interesting because what is happening here is that there is really no scientific ground, especially not in the way in which scientists define science, to support that optimism. They just blindly believe that given the past successes of science, or at least the way in which they perceive them, entitles them to say that any other sort of way of looking at the world can be improved by looking at it through the lens of science as they define it. So ironically, one of the sort of consequences of scienticism is that it leads to a lot of pseudoscience, because people get sort of this notion that in order for them to be successful in sociology or be successful in psychology or be successful in history, they may need to have their work look scientific. So they start to apply the scientific method, and they try to apply sort of the results from the hard sciences in ways that are not really appropriate for their discipline. So or ironically, I think it leads to a lot of, or it has led, especially in the first half of the 20th century, middle of the 20th century, to a lot of pseudoscience as well. Did I get them all 6?
Great answer, Professor. Professor Kees, and now about question science, logic, and mathematics. about a little the Percy. Percy, it's my one favorite pragmatism philosophers. I read the Neo Semantic book. Guy, Guy. So my question. Sorry, guys. How does the interplay between logic, metaphysics, science, and mathematics unfold, and what are the inherent limitations of these relationships? For instance, Percy, Caltonid, the mathematics does not preserve positive truths and lakes a strong dependence on logic to resolve its problems. Inherent problems.
Yeah. So Peirce was a philosopher, but he was also a physicist. He was also a mathematician. He is generally referred to as a polymath, and that is not incorrect. Um, Peirce's father was a mathematician and an astronomer, and he was the foremost mathematician in the United States. And he thought that his son Charles Peirce was better than he was. So Peirce did actually a lot of work in mathematics, and was very impressed himself with the work his father had done. Peirce takes mathematics to be a hypothetical science. That is, it doesn't say anything about the world. It is purely a voluntary mental construction, in which we set the rules for ourselves and then start to play with it. So we can look at Euclidean geometry as an example. So Euclidean geometry is a system that allows you to do certain things on the assumption that you accept certain propositions and certain transformation rules, and they are captured in terms of axioms and postulates and definitions and stuff like that. But essentially, Euclidean geometry is something that tells you about all the fun things you can do when you have a ruler and a compass. Now, it's also clear that if you go about, and you can try that in your spare time if you have any, if you of triangles, chances are that they will not all end up being such that the inner angles will all add up to 180 degrees, which is what Euclid's geometry decrees, right? The angles in a triangle add up to 180 degrees. In reality, that seldom happens. So it's not true for actual triangles. It is true for idealized triangles. Now, what happened, especially as a result of non-Euclidean geometry, 19th century mathematics, is that the separation that Euclid makes between axioms and postulates, there are really no axioms. There are really no things that we can be absolutely certain about. So basically, we postulate certain things, we postulate certain rules that we can use about these things, and then we start to work with them. And Peirce's own work, actually, both Peirce's father and Peirce's brother, James Mills Peirce, do a lot of work in quaternions, which is essentially an alternative way of doing arithmetics, because you have non-Euclidean geometry, and you only have the same sort of phenomena in arithmetic, that there are multiple arithmetics. There are countless geometries and multiple arithmetics. So mathematics is not properly about the world. At the same time, though, it can be used to describe the world in a sort of model theoretical way. And again, going back to my own background in economics, neoclassical economics used calculus as a means to capture what's going on in the exchange of goods, and is constructing these supply and demand curves so you can evaluate what happens when certain variables change, and that allows you then to, at least in theory. So mathematics, at least in Peirce's view, is something you can apply to the world. It doesn't describe the world the way it does, but it can capture something, replacing something that's really complicated by something that sort of shows structures that are assumed to be representative of that complicated phenomenon. At the same time, it's clear that since mathematics is a product of postulates and sort of transformation rules that you sort of make up yourself, it doesn't depend on logic. Is not all that different from Peirce than the relationship between mathematics and physics. You can use mathematics to develop models that you can use to sort of capture physical process as models to describe or to say something about economic processes, and you can use mathematics to say something about the way in which we reason or set up models for reasoning. So logic for Peirce is deep down a positive science. It is a science that says mathematics is not a normative science. Logic is aimed at helping us find ways to correct and to find ways to correctly represent things in thought, things about the world in thoughts, and the mathematics can be brought in to make that more precise in the same way in which mathematics can be brought in to sort of be more precise about when you shoot a cannon and you want to figure out where the cannonball will land, then calculus is a good way of doing it. So that's sort of the relationship, at least how I see it, between logic and mathematics and positive science more generally. Does that help?
Of course,
Great.
Professor. Very great answer. Um, Nearly 2 centuries after Auguste Comte, foundational writings on the sciences, how do you assess the evolution of scientific knowledge during this period? And in what ways have developments in logic and epistemology exposed the principal limitations of the positivist view of science?
Okay, yeah. So for Kant, he is an empiricist, right? He is trying to do empirical science or trying to set up the parameters for what counts as empirical science. Comte argues that knowledge has to be positive, and by that he means that it is based on observable phenomena and the regularities all between them. In a way, he's very close to Bacon. Um, Science should aim to describe, classify, and predict phenomena. It should not try to explain ultimate causes. So, of course, one of the ultimate causes that is really sort of in vogue in the 19th century is the claim made by Newton that there is the force of gravity, which then allows people to speculate. So exactly what is this force? Whose force is it, and where does it come from? To which the obvious answer, of course, at the time was God, but Newton didn't want to draw that conclusion from that. So it's Comte's positive science is a way to codify empirical science, empirical research, basically. And he has this sort of grand theory about the history of knowledge or the history of our understanding of the world, which he parses out in 3 stages: the theological stage, the metaphysical stage, and then the positive stage. It's, the terms, in a way, speak for themselves. The theological stage is the stage in which people try to explain the natural world in terms of supernatural beings. So it is this spirits, it is God and stuff like that that are responsible for the things that we see. In the metaphysical stage, in a way, those gods are being dispensed of. In a way, they're being sort of naturalized or abstracted. So now it is no longer God who is doing things, but it's the force of gravity. It is no longer spirits that rule the world, but it is nature, and then it's élan vital or something like that. So you get this metaphysical stage, and then the positive stage tries to get rid of these abstract entities and this relationship, this reliance on essences. So for science, positive science for quantum, what you're going to do is you're going to look for explanations that are really grounded in observation and experiment and the scientific method. And we see the scientific method then being further elaborated by logical positivists, and especially by bringing in much more in terms of logic, because logic has developed quite a bit in the 19th century in ways that is helpful for that. At the same time, though, for Comte, it is not just a theory of knowledge, but it's also a tool for rational social organization. And one of the things that is quite clear from Comte, but also from Peirce and the pragmatists, and for many other people working in the 19th century, is that one of the things that is really sort of playing in the background is the Industrial Revolution, and how the Industrial Revolution really changes our relationship to each other, because we are moving into the cities, we're moving away from nature, and we start to create sort of a artificial environment for ourselves with very different kinds of relationships between people. So that's why you have Marxism, that's why you have pragmatism, and that's why you have Comte's positivism, which he believes gives us a methodology for a rational social organization. So he even had an idea about a scientific religion and stuff like that. I think if you look back in the 20th century, we have seen a lot of that. So we have seen a really big impact of science on the way in which society is being structured. I think what we're seeing today is a very sharp move in the opposite direction. There is a lot of hostility towards science, precisely because it's the ways in which it tries to organize society. So um, these really emotional responses against mask mandates and vaccinations and stuff like that. I think a backlash against this rational way in which science has been trying to organize society. So I do think that Comte has played a very important role, has been very influential, and probably still is in a way, although people don't really refer to him as much. Um, and it comes with certain limitations, because it is very much focused on a sort of a technocratic approach, to a rational technocratic approach to solving social problems and political problems.
Professor Keith, final question. First, really sorry mistake your introduction, and I would like to talk. I would like to thank your reception, my invitation. It has been an honor to speak with you. You are truly a gentleman. I hope you and many eventually have the chance to talk about Percy on of your upcoming works. So, my question, Professor Case. Conclude this interview. How would you characterize your overall vision of science? In your view, what are the most pressing contemporary challenges that require the active engagement of study and research, especially in moment in the United States? And finally, would you like to share any your current or forthcoming work related to science or pragmatism? Pragmatism? Do you understand me? No?
I'm really a big supporter of the views of science that were developed by Peirce and by Susan Haack, especially as this centered on the idea of science as a human activity, and more precisely the human activity of trying to figure things out, because I still think this is really important. There are always these sort of ideas that we should go back to nature or should sort of go back to simpler times in the past, and I don't think that's really an option. We are faced with really big problems with climate change. We're faced with really big problems with in all kind of ways that require us to really try to figure out what to do about them and how to solve them if we can, and if we can solve them, what how then to find different ways of doing things. So I think that's really important. My main interest is in pragmatism, and how it can be used to try truth, goodness, and these kind of things has changed quite dramatically over the last 200 years. And I have come to see Western philosophy as very much a product of Christianity, which I wasn't really all that aware of for the longest time. The philosophical legacy that comes out of ancient Greece. And of late, I've become quite fascinated with Nietzsche, and especially his proclamation that God is dead. Of course, when Nietzsche calls out that God is dead, when he says that God is dead, he didn't mean that there was a living God that now died, although there are other people who did make that claim, but that the concept of God that emerged in the Western tradition and that came to shape it is no longer alive. It's no longer a live option for many people, to use James's terminology. So in the gay science, Nietzsche brings in a madman who enters the marketplace looking for God. And the people around him started laughing because the people around him are all atheists. They don't believe in God, so they find it sort of weird that someone is looking for God. And the madman then stares at those people and says, "We killed him." Because the madman was not looking for the living God. The madman already knew that God was dead. He was looking for a corpse. Because finding God's corpse was crucial. At least that's what the madman thought, because gods too decompose. And that's the thing that I find fascinating. What I took from this is that after the death of God, so people beginning to no longer believe in this notion, this sort of guiding principle, this idea that the universe is created by a rational being, and so on. Consequently, the worldview that it sustained begins to decompose. And like the people in the marketplace, people have no clue that it does. We need to be aware of this decomposition. We cannot just assume that nothing has changed. So what I am currently particularly interested in is how to think about concepts such as truth, and what it means to be human, without bringing in sort of unconsciously, what many people still do, notions of truth and so on that are to be understood in terms of an all-knowing God. So my new project, and I'm actually starting my sabbatical right now, is to look more closely at whether the pragmatic conception of truth can provide us with a way of dealing with that doesn't sort of commit us to this sort of absolutist sort of notion of truth that comes out of the sort of the tradition, without falling into a relativism, which is sort of the other extreme. So I'm planning to do that by retracing what Peirce was trying to do in his Architectonic of the Sciences of Discovery, where truth is a product of pragmatism, which itself is a normative rule of methodeutic that is then grounded in the more basic parts of logic, which in turn is grounded in ethics, aesthetics, and phenomenology, which all have at their disposal the positive science of mathematics. So that's sort of the direction I'm hoping to go into over the next year.
Thanks so much, Professor Kees. Now I'm going to speak Dutch, but I never speak Dutch to another person. Um, in the future, I hope live in Netherlands. I like so much Netherlands. It's especially talking to Netherlands people. So, Professor Kees, hartelijk dank voor het interview.
Oh, you're welcome. Yeah. Yeah, bedankt.
Thank you.
Het was veel plezier. Yeah.
Thank you.
I have trouble talking Dutch too.